This week, the public comment period closed on Governor Glenn Youngkin's proposed transgender policies for the public schools. Now, responses on the Virginia Regulatory Town Hall website totaled more than 66,000 as of yesterday morning. That's a stark contrast to the 9,000 public comments received for the previous policy. Quite frankly, they didn't want input from parents. As viewers and listeners to this program know, Glenn Youngkin won the Virginia governor's race on an explicitly pro-parent platform with a focus on education. Isn't that a novel idea, to focus on education in the public schools? Could this be a model for candidates in other states? Well, joining me now to talk about this and more, Meg Kilgannon, Senior Fellow for Educational Studies here at the Family Research Council. She previously served in the Department of Education in the Trump administration. Meg, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Tony. It's great to be here.
All right, you are a Virginia resident right outside of Washington, D.C. Tell us about the public comment period and how it's been received.
Well, this was one of the biggest pushes for public comments that the left has orchestrated in Virginia in recent memory. They really had the run of the place when the former governor was governor, and they have a very progressive, very pro transgender status for students kind of policy that was the policy before. So when Governor Youngkin announced his policy, released his policy about a month ago, we were really, really relieved to see that it was so clearly affirmed the rights of parents to direct the upbringing of their children. They defined the term transgender student as a student whose parent expressly writes to the school and asks for that kind of treatment of their child, putting the parent fully in charge of the students, instead of having the situation that's so common now in many school districts where they will hide a transgender student status from their parents, right, and hide that identity claim from the parent, change names, do everything, have a whole policy related to your child, a plan for your child's gender transition, and they will never tell a parent about it. That will no longer be the state of play in Virginia.
Now, just to put a fine point on that, as you make reference to some of these other school districts in other states, that's not just kind of a, individual school districts deciding to do this in many cases. It's actually state law in some cases that provide the ability for schools to hide this information from parents.
It is indeed. In states like New Jersey and California, that is the state of the law in those states, sadly. So we're very glad that Virginia will be on the right side of things when this policy is implemented. They have to factor in the comments, and there could be some changes, so we'll be watching that process closely. Of course, there are things that we would have liked to have seen strengthened, but this is such a huge improvement over what we had before that it's really just something worth applauding.
Well, speaking of things that they have to factor in, they're going to have to factor in your comments. You had a contribution to this. What did you have to say?
We did. We commented specifically on our appreciation for the central role of parents. We reviewed a lot of the case law about parental rights in Virginia, and we included for their use and edification a long appendix of research that Family Research Council has produced, affirming the true identity of children as being that they are created in the image and likeness of God and created male and female. Which is also a scientific fact. So we always appreciate the opportunity to weigh in situations like that. I've commented as a citizen on things before, just typing in my comments myself. So this was the first time that I was able to offer a more formal comment on behalf of an organization, and it was great to be able to work with the team here to get that done.
So, Meg, we watched this. We were kind of, the action arm of FRC was involved. We saw Governor Glenn Youngkin at the time, prior to being governor, lean into this issue, not run from the issue. In fact, our Pray Vote Stand event was really at the epicenter, at the zenith of this event in Leesburg, Virginia, right before the election. Is this a model for other candidates, particularly in purple states, to embrace parental rights in education?
I think that that's happening more and more often, and we're very grateful to see it. The Senate candidate Blake Masters today sent out a message on Twitter saying that he opposes child sex reassignment surgery, but Senator Kelly supports it, and the choice is Arizona's. And so to have this kind of issue that we care so deeply about, that we've been working on for years, that people were afraid to embrace, to see such a clear embrace of a great protective position for children in a political process like that is really remarkable. We are seeing it more and more, and it's just a welcome development.
Continuing on the education front, earlier this week I spoke with Congresswoman Mary Miller about the nation's report card and the abysmal scores that were clearly influenced by the pandemic and the school closures. And so I get that. I don't question the fact that, you have kids not in school for a year, it's going to have an effect. But I would think post-closure that to make up ground, we would be focused on intensifying our efforts on reading, on mathematics, where the scores were so low. But instead, we see an administration that is pushing this whole transgender agenda. I mean, that's all we're hearing out of public education these days.
Right. It is definitely a top-down problem. We have a current administration in Washington that's setting this as a priority, and it is at the expense of basic skills, and we saw that played out with the NAEP scores. And they were especially bad because of the pandemic, but they had been on a downward trajectory for a long time, and we all know that. So to have all of this, the CARES money, the COVID relief money that is still in many states largely unspent, see that being used for social emotional learning programs, which basically feed right back into the conversation you had with the previous guest on ESG. They don't have to impose a social credit system on the next generation if the next generation is involved in a social credit system that is perpetrated with surveys and questionnaires that are all done under the guise of social and emotional learning. And that is what's happening right now. So there are many problems facing the schools, and that's why Christians really need to get involved in the process and bring some common sense to this problem.
Before I leave the closure issue, I wanted to pay closer attention to it because Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona just wanted to be dismissive of that, say we can't draw too much from this. Is there a story in terms of schools or states that were more open to getting children back in and less draconian in their closure policies? Did the test scores show us anything there?
They absolutely do. Schools that reopened quickly did better on the tests than school systems that stayed closed. My state of Virginia, while we're happy about the gender policy, we scored the worst ever that we've ever scored in the history of our state. And you'll recall that whole election turned on the fact that they were so slow to reopen schools in Northern Virginia. And now you see that impacting these scores. I mean, this could be told in many other states. States that did not reopen schools or who tried to use online learning as opposed to in-person instruction fared very poorly. And it's the children who pay the price for the political decisions that adults make on their behalf. And that's why we need good people involved in that decision-making process.
Will there be any introspection on the decisions that were made in COVID and this preoccupation with gender and transgenderism in looking at these scorecards, or will it take the voters basically cleaning house?
Well, if we continue under this paradigm that we have now, which is sort of one-party rule over education, and that we know which party that is, then no, I bet there will not be much introspection, right? That's why you see parents engaging at the local level and these races becoming more competitive. More people are interested in running for local office because they see how important it is and how directly those offices affect your daily life. And so I think we are going to see some very interesting results on election night in some of these local races.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Meg Kilgannon, always great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Tony.